In the quiet folds of England's mist-covered hills, there once stood a village that made a choice so unthinkably brave, the world would remember it for centuries. A village where every breath carried both fear and an extraordinary kind of love. This place was Eyam, a peaceful stone-built settlement in 1665, where life moved slowly, gently, like the rising sun on cold green fields. No one in Eyam knew that a silent visitor was coming, one that travelled not on horses or boots, but in the folds of cloth and the fibres of wool. A visitor carried unknowingly by a tailor's assistant, who arrived with nothing but a bundle of fabric and hopes of work. Within days, the sickness began, a fever, a swelling, a scream in the night, and before the village could understand what was happening, death slipped between the houses like a shadow without footprints. People whispered that it was the plague, the same horror that had emptied towns and broken kingdoms. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Mothers clutched children, husbands held wives, doors shut, prayers rose, the church bell rang too often, carrying sorrow into every corner of the valley. Men dug graves before dawn so others wouldn't see how many were dying. Women washed the bodies of loved ones with trembling hands, and yet the sickness did not stop. Then came the moment that changed history. The village rector, William Mompesson, stood before his terrified people and asked for something no one had ever dared ask. ***, do not flee. Stay here. Stay together. If we leave, this plague will spread across England. We can die, or we can save thousands. ***, a silence fell heavier than grief. To stay meant death. To leave meant survival. But leaving would turn Eyam into a weapon that killed innocent towns for miles. And so, in an act of courage the world would later call impossible, the entire village agreed to seal itself off from the rest of England. No one would enter, no one would leave. They drew a boundary line around their home, a final circle of fate. Inside it, life became a slow whisper of sacrifice. Families placed coins soaked in vinegar on boundary stones to pay for food left by neighboring farmers. Lovers met across the field, separated by distance, touching only with their eyes. The church moved its services outdoors, people standing far apart among the trees as sermons echoed through the forest. And as the weeks turned to months, the death toll rose. But no one ran. They stayed, because the lives beyond the hills were worth more than their own fear. The wind carried their cries, the earth carried their footprints. And the world carried their story. This is the tale of Eyam, the village that chose courage over survival, love over escape, and silence over chaos. Tonight, you will walk through their quiet lanes. You will hear their whispers. You will feel the weight of their sacrifice. And as you drift into sleep, the village will rise again, not in fear, but in the gentle, eternal bravery that saved thousands. Close your eyes. This is Eyam, the village that vanished, so that others could live. The high moors around Eyam wore their usual grey on that autumn day. The stone cottages huddled along the lanes like hands folded in prayer. Life in the Peak District moved by seasoned sheep on the hills, small gardens tucked beside low walls, and a church that measured time by the slow turning of its bell. In 1665, the village seemed as it had 4 generations, ordinary, small, bound together by neighborly trade and the steady rhythm of worship. Then arrived, unnoticed, a parcel from the city. It came not by design of death, but by the ordinary course of living. Cloth was a precious thing. Tradesmen brought bolts of wool and linen from market towns, and even from London. A bundle, carried from the great city, reached Eyam through a travelling trader. No one suspected that within the folds of that fine fabric rode a deadly passenger, fleas infected with the plague's bacillus, hidden in lint and seam. The first sign was small, a nameless sorrow, a fever here, a swelling there. A woman fell ill and did not rise. Folk took it at first for an ordinary fever. Houses smelled of vinegar and herbs. The rector and the parish neighbours watched and prayed. Then the bell tolled for burial after burial, a sound that began to change the village's mood from puzzled concern to a heavy, gathering dread. Eyam's population in those years was small, only a few hundred souls. When the deaths began to accumulate, it became clear this was no ordinary sickness. The pattern matched what wandering tales called the Great Plague: sudden heat, blackened swellings, and a swiftness that left households stunned. Men who were hale at dawn could be buried by night. The church register kept faithfully began to fill with names. William Mompesson was a young rector, newly installed in Eyam. He saw the names. He saw the widows. He listened to the weeping. And the weight of responsibility fell hard upon him. Alongside him stood a man of different persuasion, Thomas Stanley, who had been the village's former preacher, and whose Puritan leanings had once been reason for a disagreement. In an extraordinary joining, these two men, one appointed, one respected by many parishioners, spoke to the village together. Their unity would become one of Eyam's defining acts. The council of neighbours gathered. The question that hung in the mist was terrible and simple. What should they do? Run and try to save their own households, taking the sickness like a flame into neighbouring towns, or stay and risk that the horror would sweep through every cottage in Eyam, ending them all but protecting others? Rector Mompesson's voice carried a hushed authority. He spoke of duty, of Christian love beyond the self, and of the terrible mathematics of contagion. The Puritan Thomas Stanley urged restraint and charity. Together, they proposed a course no law had ever prescribed. The village would isolate itself. A boundary would be drawn around Eyam. No one would cross it to go out, and none would be permitted to enter. They would bear the calamity within their own fields. The choice was not made at once. Families argued, hearts fought with fear and with principle. Some considered escape, until conscience and compassion tightened their throats. Traders and neighbours outside the boundary tried to persuade them otherwise. Food, shelter, and offers were set at the edge of the parish. Those offers, however, came with conditions that had to be solved without breach. How to pay for goods without contact. How to place value on a life when coins could carry death. The villagers and their ministers answered with a practical mercy. Payment would be left on boundary stones to prevent contagion. The coins would be laid in bowls of vinegar, known then as a means of purify. Mompesson's well, a spring at the village's boundary, became the place where goods were exchanged and where clinking copper met the sour wash of vinegar. The well's water would stand as a witness to sacrifice. Later, travellers would point to that place and say, "This is where they paid for bread and for courage." As the quarantine tightened, daily life took on new rhythms. The chapel services were moved into the open, the congregation standing apart under bare trees as the ministers read scripture aloud, so voices would carry without crowded pews. The blacksmith, the baker, and the shepherd altered the hours of their work to avoid gatherings. Houses were marked with the names of those who had died, and the living learned to leave food in designated places for the bereaved, then step back and watch from a distance. Grief appeared in 100 small acts, a woman washing another's hands before burial with trembling devotion, a neighbor shoveling a grave at dawn so a family might not witness the last cold touch, children learning early the shape of sorrow that cannot be soothed by play. Yet amid the pall of fear, there were acts that glowed quietly: shared blankets, prayers whispered through keyholes, fathers teaching children to tie knots, mothers stitching tiny comforts from shrunken yards of cloth. It would not be melodramatic to say that Eyam became a crucible of choice. Every day required decisions: who would bury, who would care for the ill, who would walk the lanes at night to tend a fire. The toll mounted. Contemporary estimates recorded that out of a population numbering roughly 300 to 400, nearly 2/3 fell in the first year of calamity. Later parish records and memorials would settle upon figures near 260 to 270 death statistics that are cold on paper but heavy in the bones of anyone who studies them. And yet, in that arithmetic of loss, Eyam's defiant compassion worked its deeper miracle. By not fleeing, by containing the plague within the parish boundary, the village likely prevented the spread of the disease into the surrounding market towns and villages. It was a sacrifice chosen, not forced community choosing to shoulder destruction. so that neighboring lives might be spared. When the plague's grip finally loosened, the village that remained found itself hollowed and weary. Households whose linings had once rung with laughter now threaded their days with remembrance. The ministers, the folks who had guided decisions, counted the cost. They had endured scorn and praise in different measures. History, however, would come to honor their decision as an example of selfless human governance in the face of terror. Tonight, as you listen in the quiet of your own room, the lanes of Eyam will feel near. Imagine the frost on the stone, the hush over fields where sheep graze without human song, the low glow of a neighbor's candle through a frosty window. Think of the coin, washed in vinegar at the boundary stone. Think of Montpesson's well with water moving slow and clear, both small monuments to a moral choice that still speaks. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the hush of those hills settle your heart. This is only the beginning of the village's account. The story of Eyam is a long, quiet book of grief and of obligation, a story that shows how ordinary people, bound by love and by faith, can stand against a terrible tide and choose the harder, kinder way. The weeks that followed the first decision were unlike anything Eyam had ever endured. From the outside, the village looked unchanged: stone cottages standing firm, sheep grazing on the hillside, smoke rising from chimneys. But inside each home, the presence of the plague clung like a cold mist that refused to lift. Families spoke in whispers, footsteps softened, and doors opened only when absolutely necessary. The once busy lanes grew quiet, carrying only the sound of wind brushing against the walls. At first, some villagers still hoped the sickness would burn out quickly. They remembered tales of fevers that came and passed with the seasons. But the plague was not a visitor that left gently. It took without warning. A man who tended his field by noon could become bedridden by dusk. A mother who tucked her children into bed could be gone by morning. The village register began to fill with names faster than the rector could read them at services. Rector Montpesson and Thomas Stanley travelled the lanes carefully, distantly offering prayers at doorways and leaving small parcels of herbs believed to ease suffering. There were no proper doctors within the village. Remedies came from old knowledge: rosemary, sage, vinegar cloths, warm stones placed near the feet. Most of it did little, yet families clung to anything that felt like hope. Outside the village boundary, neighboring communities honored the self-imposed isolation. They left food and supplies on flat stones near the edge of Eyam. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes under moonlight, villagers approached those stones only after the outsiders departed, placing coins washed in vinegar into carved hollows. This strange ritual formed a bridge between the quarantined and the world beyond. Silent, distant, yet compassionate. As the death toll rose, new challenges emerged. Graves needed digging, many, too many. In normal times, the village would gather for burials, songs and prayers rising over the fields. Now funerals took place with only a handful of mourners, sometimes none at all. Some families buried their own loved ones to avoid risking further spread. At Riley Graves, a woman named Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 children with her own hands over the course of a few days, a fact recorded in parish memory with reverence and sorrow. Her devotion became one of the most remembered symbols of Eyam's courage. Yet even amid the grief, there were small signs of unity. Villagers left bread on windowsills for those too weak to work. Children waved to friends from a distance. Their play reduced to quiet gestures across lanes. Neighbors called to one another from doorsteps, speaking of weather, of sheep, of the sky, anything to remind each other that they were not alone. The church services held outdoors became a rhythm of resilience. Parishioners gathered among the trees at Cucklet Delph, spacing themselves far apart. There, surrounded by open air, Montpesson read scripture that comforted without making false promises. He spoke of endurance, of compassion, of the courage required to carry burdens together. The wind carried his voice across the hillside, mingling with birdsong. These gatherings preserved a sense of community that the plague tried so hard to break. Summer turned to autumn again, and with the change of season came a deeper stillness. The sickness struck in waves, quiet 4 days, then sudden and fierce. Some households remained untouched, while their neighbors suffered terrible losses. Survivors struggled with the guilt of being spared. Unsure why fate had chosen differently, Montpesson offered counsel as best he could. We are each given a duty. Some are called to endure, others to comfort, and others to remember. Among the stories carefully preserved in local records was that of a young couple, Emmet Seidel and her beloved Roland. When the plague struck Eyam, Roland lived outside the boundary, determined not to break the quarantine. The two met across a field at a safe distance, speaking only with their eyes and soft calls carried by the wind. Their separation became a symbol of the quiet sacrifices made in the name of love. Historical accounts say that one day, Roland came to their meeting place, but Emmet never appeared again. She had become one of the plague's many victims. Roland returned each day for weeks, never knowing that she was already gone. Their story lives on as one of the most poignant memories of the village's ordeal. By winter, the plague had carved deep marks through Eyam. Many homes stood silent. Some families were entirely gone, yet the boundary remained unbroken. Not a single villager fled. Despite overwhelming fear and grief, their commitment prevented the spread of disease into towns like Bakewell and Sheffield, an outcome later acknowledged by officials and historians. When the final wave of sickness began to fade, an exhausted hush settled over Eyam. Families emerged carefully, blinking in the pale winter sun. The village was altered. Its population nearly halved, its lanes filled with echoes of loss. But in that silence, something else lingered, an unspoken strength. Eyam had faced a terror that could have destroyed much more than itself, and yet through unity and sacrifice, it protected the wider world. In time, letters from surrounding areas arrived, expressing gratitude and sorrow. Farmers sent extra grain, churches sent blankets and candles. Travelers left notes of respect near the boundary stones. For your courage, we remember you. The survivors carried on, tending fields, repairing homes, and rebuilding lives. They planted new gardens where old ones had grown wild. They restored fences and cleaned wells. Slowly, gently, the rhythms of life returned. But Eyam would never forget the year the plague walked its lanes, nor would history. The story of this small village, its fear, its losses, its strength became a lesson passed down through generations. That even in the face of destruction, ordinary people can choose extraordinary compassion. And so, in the quiet of your own night, as sleep begins to gather, imagine those hills lying still beneath a pale moon, the stones cool beneath your hand, the wind carrying the faint memory of voices that once whispered promises of courage. The sacrifice of Eyam remains, carried in the silence of the earth itself. As winter deepened over Eyam, the cold seemed to settle not just on rooftops and fields, but in the hearts of the villagers who had endured month after month of fear. The frost clung to the stones of the cottages, turning the village lanes into pale ribbons beneath a motionless sky. Smoke rising from chimneys became a quiet sign of survivor leech thin line, a reminder that someone inside was still alive, still holding on. Rector Montpesson moved carefully through the village, visiting doorsteps rather than entering homes. He spoke through partially opened shutters, leaving small parcels of herbs, broth, or folded letters of encouragement. Records tell that he read prayers aloud in the cold, his breath turning to mist as he blessed the sick from a distance. He himself had lost many friends, and grief followed him like a shadow. Yet he carried on, because his people needed a steady voice. In cottages where sickness lingered, families did what they could. They warmed stones in the hearth to place near the feet of the fevered. They prepared infusions of mint, rosemary, and lemon balm, herbs believed to clear the air. Some sat awake through the nights, whispering hymns or comforting children who trembled from nightmares. Outside, in the stillness, the wind carried faint laments that drifted from one house to another. The boundary stones around Eyam became symbols of hope and fear. Goods left by neighboring villages, bread, oats, candles, and even letters of sympathy waited on the stones each morning. The coins that villagers placed in vinegar-filled hollows gleamed faintly in the cold light. This ritual had become part of their lifeline. People approached quietly, sometimes pausing to whisper a thank you to the unseen hands that sustained them. Among the villagers, certain names were whispered with reverence. One was Catherine Mompesson, the rector's wife. Historical accounts describe her as gentle and steadfast. She comforted families, wrote letters to those outside the village, and stood beside her husband at outdoor services. As the plague spread, she continued to care for others even when exhaustion hollowed her cheeks. In August of the plague year, she, too, fell ill. Her death marked one of the heaviest losses for the rector. And yet he carried on, driven by a duty he believed came from God. His letters from that time speak of a grief to deep 4 words, and a faith that must hold even when the heart breaks. In contrast to the sorrow, there were moments of quiet heroism. A shepherd named Marshall Howe, who had survived an early infection, helped bury the dead when others feared to approach the bodies. Immune by chance rather than choice, he performed this solemn work through wind, rain, and snow. Though some distrusted him for having lived through the sickness, later generations remembered him with gratitude for carrying a burden few could bear. As the plague moved into its final months, its spread became unpredictable. Some houses that had escaped illness for half a year suddenly suffered their first losses. Others, ravaged early, remained untouched through the winter. This strange pattern, recorded in parish documents, puzzled even scholars centuries later. For the villagers, it meant every day held uncertainty. Joy and dread sat side by side at every table. Through all this, the villagers clung to small comforts. They baked when they could. They told stories near the hearth. Children, though confined, found ways to play rolling small stones, carving little shapes into wood, or tracing patterns in frost on windows. These moments did not erase grief, but they softened it just enough to continue. When spring finally approached, a faint but unmistakable change came to Eyam. The air grew milder, the woods filled with birdsong. The number of funerals began to fall. Families emerged cautiously, tending gardens overrun with winter's neglect, trees that had stood bare through months of sorrow unfurled new leaves, a gentle promise that the world still held life beyond suffering. The plague's end is marked in records by the month of November 1666, though its force had already weakened by early autumn. When the final cases faded, the village slowly allowed itself to hope. Survivors visited one another, standing in silence before speaking, uncertain how to address the enormity of what they had endured. Yet despite the losses, the village held together, just as it had at the beginning, through quiet strength and shared sacrifice. As the weight of the past year settled into memory, Eyam understood what its choice had meant. Their self-isolation had prevented the plague from reaching larger towns. Their sacrifice had saved countless lives, and though the price had been terrible, the legacy they left was one of courage unmatched by many places touched by the epidemic. The hills around Eyam seemed to breathe again. The fields glowed a gentler green. Sheep grazed softly, unaware of the tragedy their shepherds had faced. Life returned, step by slow step, and within the village, stories began to rise, stories that ensured the world would never forget what Eyam had done in the face of overwhelming fear. Even now, if you stand in the valley at dusk, the air carries a strange, solemn calm. It is said that the stones remember, the wind remembers, the wells remember, and the earth holds the quiet echo of a village that chose sacrifice over survival and lived forever in history's heart. The first true sign that Eyam had survived came not with words, but with sound: the soft knock of a neighbor at a door, the cry of a newborn lamb on the hillside, the distant echo of a hammer repairing a loose stone. These small sounds, once ordinary, now felt like miracles. After so many months when silence had pressed itself over the village like a shroud, these gentle noises were the first breaths of a community learning to live again. Yet survival brought its own quiet weight. The villagers stepped out into lanes where the memories of those they had lost lingered like long shadows. Doors that remained closed told their own stories. Some cottages stood empty, their windows dark, ivy creeping along the stones as if nature itself had come to claim what grief had left behind. Neighbors paused before these houses, touching their walls lightly, whispering the names of those who once lived there. Rector Mompesson, worn by sorrow and exhaustion, continued to walk the village. His wife's absence followed him with every step. Still, he offered what comfort he could: letters, prayers, counsel spoken with a voice that carried both strength and heartbreak. Records say his health faltered after the plague, but he did not leave Eyam immediately. He stayed to help the people rebuild the rhythm of daily life. Families began reopening their gardens. Fields left untended 4 months were now carefully cleared. Herbs were planted anew. Though many villagers could not bring themselves to use rosemary or sage the way they once did, those scents had become reminders of sick rooms and vigil nights. In time, neighboring villages began approaching the boundary stones again. There was no longer fear in their eyes, but sorrow and admiration. They brought extra grain, tools, cloth, and letters of gratitude. Some wrote that Eyam's sacrifice had prevented devastation in towns that would have collapsed under the weight of the plague. Others offered to shelter survivors or help rebuild homes, but most Eyam families chose to remain where they had always lived, among the stones that held their memories. Spring brought color back to the valley. Wildflowers bloomed along pathways that had seen to many funerals. Children began to play at the edges of fields once more. Though their games were quieter, their laughter gentler. They had grown older in ways no child should. The plague year had carved knowledge into their eyes, the kind that lives deeper than words. One of the most painful tasks was restoring the church. Its bells, silent for months except during burials, finally rang again, not in mourning, but in thanksgiving. Outdoor services slowly moved back indoors as the danger faded. Parishioners sat farther apart than before, out of habit and memory, but their voices joined in hymns that rose through the stone arches like a long-delayed exhale. There were moments when the villagers gathered at Mompesson's well, touching the stones that had served as their lifeline during quarantine. Some wept quietly. Others whispered prayers for the souls of those who had passed. The boundary stones, once symbols of isolation, had become monuments of selfless determination. Historians later noted that Eyam's choice was not driven by law or orders, it was driven by conscience. No soldiers enforced the boundary. No officials commanded them. Ordinary people, farmers and shepherds, mothers and laborers, chosen not by rank, but by necessity, had stood against an invisible enemy and protected countless lives beyond their sight. As months blended into a gentler year, relatives of the dead returned to Eyam from other towns. They came to lay flowers at graves, to embrace surviving family members, and to walk quietly through the lanes where their loved ones had once lived. They found a village scarred, but unbroken, held together by threads of courage and sacrifice. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills, a soft calm settled over the valley. People sat outside their cottages, sharing stories of those they had lost, stories that healed, stories that kept memories alive. They spoke of bravery, of kindness, of neighbors who had cared for the sick even when fear threatened to consume them. They spoke of the strange strength that had allowed them to stay when every instinct urged them to run. And slowly, gently, Eyam began to live again. But the land held the memory of what had happened. The stones, warmed by the sun, seemed to remember hands that had once touched them in prayer. The pathways remembered footsteps that no longer fell, and the wind that swept across the hills carried with it the soft echo of voices long gone, voices that had chosen sacrifice over escape. Even now, standing in that valley centuries later, one might feel the quiet truth that lives beneath the earth, that a small village, through grief and courage, chose to save strangers they would never meet, and the world, knowingly or not, still breathes because of that choice. The months after the plague loosened its grip brought Eyam into a new kind of season, a season of counting, of remembering, and of learning to live with the emptiness left behind. When the final cases faded and no new graves were dug, the villagers stepped cautiously back into the life they had protected. Though life itself felt strangely unfamiliar, spring sunlight fell on the stone cottages, as it always had, but the people who emerged into it were changed. Entire families were missing. Some households stood completely abandoned, doors closed, chimneys cold. Those who survived walked through the village with quiet steps, often pausing before homes that no longer held the warmth of voices or the smell of cooking hearts. One by one, the villagers began the slow work of restoring what had been lost. Fields that had grown wild during the quarantine were cleared with careful hands. Sheep were gathered from the hills. Gardens were planted again, though many fingers trembled as they touched the soil, remembering loved ones who had tended these same gardens the year before. The neighboring towns, which Eyam had protected through its sacrifice, began to return the kindness. Wagons brought timber, grain, medicines, and blankets. Letters arrived filled with gratitude, some addressed simply to the brave people of Eyam. These gestures carried immense meaning. They reminded the villagers that their suffering had not been in vain, that the world beyond the boundary stones had lived because they had chosen to stay. Among the survivors were individuals whose names would become woven into the memory of the village. One such figure was Mary Cooper, who kept a careful record of the losses, writing in her diary names and dates, so the world would know the depth of Eyam's grief. Another was Marshall Howe, who continued tending graves long after the plague had passed, placing stones at the head of each mound, so that the dead would be remembered with dignity. Inside the church, the air still carried the faint smell of herbs and candle wax used during the dark months. When services resumed indoors, people entered with a reverence that bordered on awe. They chose their seats quietly, leaving spaces where loved ones once sat. The sound of singing filled the building again. For the first time in nearly a year, a sound both beautiful and sorrowful, rising through the rafters like a collective breath of healing. Rector Mompesson, though weakened by grief, took his place at the altar. His voice was softer now, but it carried the weight of everything the village had endured. Historical letters he wrote after the plague speak of a flock ravaged, but not broken, and of his belief that the village had been protected in spirit even when not in body. He spoke not of triumph, but of endurance, of faith held quietly, fiercely, in the face of fear. The villagers found comfort in rituals. They visited the boundary stones that had once marked their world's edge. Some left flowers there. Others touched the stones as if greeting old companions. Mompesson's well, where coins had been dropped in vinegar to buy food safely, became a symbol of survival. Parents told children why the well mattered, teaching them the story of courage that had preserved the surrounding towns. Love, too, attempted to heal. Young men and women who had survived looked to one another with a new gentleness, aware of how fragile life had proven to be. New marriages were recorded in the parish register the following year, a small sign that hope still had roots in Eyam. But the pain was not forgotten. Survivors spoke often of the strange quiet that had hung over the village during the worst months. They remembered the distant calls of gravediggers, the soft cries of children, the rustle of the wind through empty lanes. Even as life returned, these memories lived like shadows, not frightening, but solemn. Some families left Eyam after the plague, unable to bear the losses their homes held. They moved to nearby towns, taking with them the quiet strength formed during quarantine. Others chose to stay, believing the land held not just sorrow, but also the story of their ancestors' courage. As the seasons turned, Eyam healed in slow circles. Wildflowers grew thick over the graves, painting the earth with color where grief had once settled. Trees in the churchyard spread new branches. The hills, unchanged by human sorrow, continued their gentle rise and fall under the English sky. Years later, travelers passing through the region heard the story of Eyam and stood in silence before the graves and boundary stones. They spoke with the descendants of survivors who kept the memory alive, and each person who listened understood that what Eyam had done was something rare in human history, a choice made not for glory or recognition, but for love of strangers beyond their sight. In the quiet evenings, as the sun dipped behind the hills, villagers sometimes gathered outside their cottages, watching the fading light. They spoke of family, of harvests, of the year that had reshaped their lives. And sometimes, when the wind blew softly, they believed they could still hear faint echoes from the past voices of those who had given everything so that the world outside Eyam might live. With every passing year, the story became less about tragedy and more about the courage of ordinary people. It became a reminder that even the smallest village can carry the greatest strength, and that sometimes the bravest acts happen far from battlefields, in places where the only witnesses are hills, stone walls, and the quiet sky above. Eyam endured, and in enduring, it left behind a legacy that time has never erased. When the plague finally loosened its grip, it did not leave Eyam in triumph or in relief. It left in a long, uneven quiet, as though the sickness itself were stepping backward into the hills. Even as families began to regain their strength, the village felt hollow, like a song missing half its notes. The lanes remained slow and somber. People walked with careful steps, still carrying the weight of grief that clung to their memories like morning mist. Recovery was not a single moment. It happened in fragments. A window that had stayed closed for months was opened again. A child laughed softly for the first time since losing a parent. A sheep bleated in a field long neglected. The distant sound of a hammer repairing a door echoed through the valley. These small things were signs that life had begun to return, even if the wounds beneath it were still fresh. The survivors gathered often at the outdoor service ground. Cucklet delved the same place where they had listened to the rector's sermons from afar to avoid spreading infection. Now, they came not in fear but in remembrance. They stood spaced apart out of habit, their eyes drifting toward the sky as if searching for meaning in the clouds. Rector Mompesson's voice carried a new softness when he spoke. He reminded them that endurance was not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise again, despite it. It was during these gatherings that the magnitude of their sacrifice became clearer. Visitors from nearby towns, now safe, came to offer thanks. Some approached Mompesson with tears, saying their communities would have suffered terribly if Eyam had not contained the plague within its boundaries. Others left small gifts: bread, apples, coins, wool, simple offerings that carried deep gratitude. Within the village, some of the most profound acts of resilience came from survivors who had endured the heaviest losses. A woman who had buried nearly her entire family took in orphan children. A farmer who had lost his wife spent his evenings carving wooden markers for unmarked graves so that no name would fade from memory. A young man whose sweetheart had died visited the boundary field where they had once spoken from afar, sitting silently in the grass as if waiting for her voice to return on the wind. The landscape itself seemed changed. Fields once vibrant with activity were now quiet. Wildflowers grew freely around the graves of those lost, covering the earth like a soft blanket. The churchyard, filled with names that had been added to quickly, became a place of deep reflection. Some villagers visited daily, kneeling beside simple stones, whispering stories to the loved ones they had lost. Despite the sorrow, there were moments of unexpected peace. At dusk, when the sun spilled its last light across the hills, the village felt held by an almost sacred calm. Survivors would often gather outside their homes, sharing soft conversations. They spoke not about death, but about small, hopeful things: the coming harvest, a newborn lamb, the sound of rain on rooftops. These conversations became gentle threads stitching the community back together. One evening, as spring settled, a traveller from Sheffield came to the edge of the village with a letter addressed to Mompesson. It spoke of lives saved, hundreds, perhaps thousands, because Eyam had chosen to seal itself off. The traveller left the letter on the boundary stone and stepped back respectfully. When the rector retrieved it, he read its words slowly, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. Eyam's choice had not been forgotten. Slowly, families repaired homes and rebuilt routines. Tools were passed from hand to hand. Bread was shared between households. Even laughter, hesitant at first, began to return. It was never loud, never careless. It carried a depth shaped by sorrow, as if every smile honored the ones who could no longer smile. Some villagers left Eyam after the plague, unable to remain among so many reminders of loss, but many stayed, believing that the land held the echoes of both their grief and their courage, and they felt a responsibility to keep the memory alive, not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to the strength that had carried them through the darkest year of their lives. Generations later, visitors walking through the village would still feel the weight of its history. They would stop at Montpesson's well, tracing the layered stones with their fingers, imagining the coins dropped into vinegar to keep distant neighbors safe. They would stand in the quiet of the churchyard, reading the names carved into weathered stones. They would walk the same paths where villagers once whispered prayers and where children once played beside empty cottages. And even centuries later, the silence of Eyam held a kind of reverence, a reminder that here, in this small place, ordinary people made an extraordinary choice. The survivors never claimed heroism. They never asked for recognition. They simply rebuilt their lives, slowly and quietly, carrying the memory of what had happened in the depth of their hearts. But history did not forget. It could not, because Eyam was not just a village that endured suffering, it was a village that protected thousands beyond its hills, offering itself like a shield against an unseen enemy. And in that act, Eyam's story became timeless. As the village settled into the aftermath of its long isolation, the people of Eyam found themselves living in a landscape reshaped not only by loss, but by memory. The hills that once echoed with daily chatter now carried a quieter tone, as if the land itself understood what it had witnessed. Every lane, every stone wall, every field carried the imprint of the sacrifice they had made. For many survivors, the first challenge was learning how to live in a world that felt strangely hollow. Families who had once shared meals around crowded tables now sat with empty chairs. Children who had lost parents learned too quickly what responsibility meant. Husbands came home to rooms that no longer smelled of their wives' herbs. Wives walked past gardens where their husbands once worked at dawn. Their grief lived in every ordinary movement, drawing water, grinding grain, lighting candles in the evening. Yet Eyam was determined not to collapse under the weight of its sorrow. Piece by piece, the villagers helped one another rebuild. Tools were shared freely, hands offered where needed. A neighbor repaired another's roof. Someone else helped clear the overgrown fields left untouched for months. These acts became the threads that held the surviving community together. The church archives from those years note how the villagers continued gathering for services at Cucklet Delph for many weeks after the plague had ended. Although indoor worship had resumed, many still preferred the fresh air, the open sky, and the feeling of safety it offered. They stood beneath the trees, remembering the sermons that had carried them through the darkest days. Their voices, lifted in hymns, sounded gentler, almost reverent, as if mindful of those who could no longer sing. Rector Montpesson, though deeply affected by his wife's death, continued his ministry. Historical letters reveal his struggle. His words sometimes trembled, and he often paused to gather himself. Yet the villagers drew comfort from his presence. He had guided them through a period when fear could easily have turned to chaos. Now, his quiet resilience helped them heal. It was said that when he prayed, the entire valley seemed to listen. As recovery continued, the boundary stones, once symbols of imprisonment, became markers of pride. Visitors began to arrive from nearby towns, staying at the edges of the village out of respect. They brought food, clothing, and kind words. Some had lost relatives to the plague elsewhere and came to thank Eyam for preventing further spread. Others had only heard whispers of the village's courage and wished to see the place for themselves. The villagers welcomed these visitors, but always with a gentle, reserved modesty. They were not proud of their suffering, nor did they seek to be praised. They simply believed they had done what was right. In the evenings, after the visitors departed, the survivors sometimes sat together and spoke quietly about how strange it felt to be admired for something born from pain. Eyam's children, who had endured so much fear, began once again to find joy in small things: skipping stones in the brook, collecting feathers from the fields, chasing shadows in the lengthening light of summer evenings. These simple games carried a healing energy. Their laughter, though softer than before, drifted through the village like a promise that life would continue. There were stories that villagers passed down privately, stories of miraculous escapes, unexpected recoveries, and acts of kindness. One tale told of a woman who walked miles to deliver herbs to a sick friend at the boundary, leaving them on a stone and praying long after she had gone. Another spoke of a father who stood outside his infected home every night, singing softly so his children inside would know he was still there. None of these stories were written formally, but they lived in the spoken history of the village. As the seasons changed again, the colors of the Peak District returned in full radiance. Summer spread warmth across fields that had known too much hardship. Autumn painted the hills with gold and rust. Winter brought quiet snow, which softened everything it touched. With each season, Eyam grew stronger, its scars becoming part of its identity, though other than a source of only pain. Travelers who passed through the region began to remark on a strange sense of peace in the village. The lanes, though quiet, felt safe. The cottages seemed to stand with a steadier kind of strength. Many commented that something sacred lingered in the air, a stillness built not on silence, but on the memory of courage. Through it all, the villagers kept telling their story to their children, not as a tale of despair, but as a living reminder of love, sacrifice, and duty. They taught them why the boundary stones mattered, why the churchyard must be tended with care, why the names in the register were written with such respect, and in doing so, they ensured that Eyam's legacy would never fade. Years later, historians would write about Eyam as a place where ordinary people performed an extraordinary act. But for the villagers, it was simply their home, a place they protected not for fame, but for faith, for kindness, and for the hope that the world beyond their valley would be spared the suffering they had endured. And in the quiet of the nights that followed, when the wind blew softly across the hills, it carried with it the steady heartbeat of a village that had survived the unthinkable not through strength alone, but through compassion woven into every stone and every breath. As time moved forward, the people of Eyam to weave their lives again around the memories of those they had lost. The village, once shaken by fear and sorrow, began to find a quiet rhythm. Every dawn brought new responsibilities, and every dusk carried the soft ache of remembering. But Eyam continued, not in loud celebration, but in gentle persistence. The air in the village felt different now. Morning light fell across the stone cottages in a softer way, as though respecting the grief that still lived inside the walls. Some survivors said that the village seemed to breathe with them, exhaling sorrow, inhaling hope. The hills surrounding Eyam stood like guardians, the same hills that had watched over the isolation, now witnessing the slow return of life. Families walked together through the lanes that had once been empty. Their steps were slower, more thoughtful. They paused often, touching stone walls or looking toward fields where familiar figures no longer worked. The silence between two people often said more than words could. In this new world, grief had become part of conversation, not spoken directly, but understood deeply. One evening, as the sky flamed red with the setting sun, a group of villagers gathered near the boundary stone where coins had once been placed in vinegar. They brought flowers, wild flowers picked from the fields bordering the village. They placed them at the stone quietly, honoring not only those they had lost, but the invisible line that had protected countless others beyond. The stone, weathered by time and touched by hundreds of hands, had become a symbol of sacrifice, a small monument to a great act. Further into the village, old friendships grew stronger. Neighbors who had once lived separate lives now leaned more heavily on one another. They shared meals, harvested together, rebuilt fences that had fallen into disrepair during the plague year. In the evenings, they sat outside their cottages, speaking softly while watching the last of the daylight fade. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes they simply shared the silence. A memory often spoken of was the story of the Seidel family, especially young Emmett. Her love for Roland, the man who lived beyond the boundary, remained one of the most tender stories of the plague. Roland had visited every day during quarantine, waiting at a distance for a glimpse of her, but she had never returned after falling ill. When the plague ended, Roland came one last time, unaware she was gone, and learned the truth from a villager who approached with slow, heavy steps. His grief became part of the village's own sorrow. Even decades later, people told the story softly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile memory. In the months following the plague, Eyam became a place visited by scholars, priests, and travelers who wished to understand how such a small community had made such a profound choice. They arrived with questions, notebooks, and deep respect, often asking to meet the survivors. But the villagers rarely spoke of themselves as heroes. They simply explained what they had done and why. We stayed so others might live. Their modesty, as much as their bravery, impressed those who came to listen. Inside the church, the sound of hymns once again filled the air each week. The survivors sang softly at first, then more confidently. The sound did not hide their grief, it carried it. Each voice seemed to hold a story, and together those stories rose into the arches and drifted back down like a blessing. The church had witnessed countless funerals in the plague year. Now it witnessed something just as powerful, a community learning to hope again. Children, who had once watched their parents whisper fearful prayers, now ran through fields with new friends. They splashed through shallow streams and chased one another under the shade of tall trees. Laughter began to ripple through Eyam again, like a healing thread, stitching new life over old wounds. Parents watched them with mixed emotions, joy for their innocence, sorrow for the children who were no longer there to join them. Many villagers wrote letters to relatives in distant towns, telling them that Eyam still stood. These letters often spoke of emptiness, but also of gratitude for survival, for neighbors, for the strength they had found in one another. Some letters exist even today, preserved in archives as gentle echoes of that time. As the seasons continued their eternal turning, Eyam became a place where memory and hope lived side by side. The plague year had carved deep scars into the village, but those scars did not weaken it. Instead, they became reminders of the bravery shown by ordinary people who faced extraordinary fear. Travelers who passed through Eyam years later reported feeling something unusual in the air, a calm that was almost sacred. Some said the village felt like a living memorial, where every stone carried a story, and every gust of wind whispered fragments of the past. The legacy of Eyam did not fade. It grew with each person who learned its tale. For the villagers themselves, life continued gently. They tended gardens, repaired walls, raised children, and honored the memory of those who had gone. They did not seek attention or praise. They simply lived, quietly, humbly, with the knowledge that their choice had saved countless others. And in every soft footstep along the village paths, in every candle lit at dusk, in every whispered prayer carried into the hills, the spirit of Eyam endured, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the strength of a community bound by love, sacrifice, and unbreakable resolve. In the years that followed the plague, Eyam transformed into more than just a village. It became a symbol whispered across England, a place spoken of with quiet reverence. The story of its sacrifice crossed hills and towns, carried by travelers, merchants, priests, and scholars, until it became part of the wider memory of the land. But for the people who lived in Eyam, life was not shaped by fame. It was shaped by the slow rebuilding of what they had lost. Each morning, survivors stepped out of their cottages, with the same careful pause, listening to the silence that once held so much fear. Eventually, that silence began to feel different. It no longer carried dread. It felt like respect, like a memory that had learned to settle gently. The air was softer, the wind carrying not sorrow, but the quiet strength of a community that had faced the unthinkable. Some of the most fragile moments came when villagers returned to the places they had avoided during the plague. A mother walked into the garden where her children used to play, touching the leaves of the plants they had once watered together. A shepherd returned to the barn where his brother had fallen ill, standing for a long time in the doorway before taking a single step inside. A wife entered the room where her husband had taken his final breath, opening the shutters as though letting in the light for him one last time. These moments were simple. but they were monumental. Every act of remembering helped the survivors reclaim a part of their lives. As the village rebuilt, the stories of those who had shown extraordinary courage became threads woven into daily conversation. People spoke of Elizabeth Hancock, who had buried her husband and 6 children with her own hands. They spoke of Marshall Howe, who buried the dead when no one else could. They spoke of families who cared for the sick even when fear threatened to undo them. These stories lived in the air of Eyam, carried like seeds that took root in the hearts of each new generation. The boundary stones remained untouched, standing like sentinels in the fields. Villagers often visited them at sunset, placing flowers or simply resting a hand upon the rough stone surface. These stones had once marked the edge of life, the point beyond which no one would go. Now, they stood as reminders of unity, silent witnesses to a decision that saved countless lives beyond the hills. In time, people from distant towns and even faraway countries traveled to Eyam, wanting to understand how an entire village had chosen isolation instead of escape. They met the survivors older now, their faces lined with loss and quiet pride. The visitors asked questions about the quarantine, the burials, the rituals, but the villagers always answered with humility. They did not speak of themselves as heroes. They spoke of duty, of faith, and of love for one another. The landscape around Eyam continued to heal. Meadows once marked by fresh graves began to bloom with wildflowers. Children ran across these fields again, unaware of the sorrow that slept beneath the soil. Life returned in gentle waves, new marriages, new harvests, new voices singing inside the church. One summer, the villagers rebuilt a crumbling wall near the churchyard. As they worked, they found themselves sharing memories of those buried beyond the stones. The conversation was not heavy. It was warm, almost tender. They spoke of the way someone used to laugh, or how another always helped repair roofs, or how a child loved chasing butterflies in the spring. These memories lifted the heaviness that had hung over the village for so long. There were also stories of forgiveness, of neighbors who had once argued over small things now helping one another rebuild homes. The plague had changed their hearts. It had made them understand how precious and fragile every life was. Old quarrels dissolved like frost under the morning sun. In the evenings, when the village gathered for worship or shared meals, they sometimes read the names of the lost aloud, not in mourning, but in remembrance. Each name was spoken like a blessing, keeping their presence alive in the village they had loved so deeply. Historians who later studied Eyam often wrote about its courage, about how the villagers' decision prevented the plague from spreading into cities like Sheffield and beyond. They wrote about leadership, about community, about sacrifice. But what the books could never fully capture was the quiet humanity that sustained Eyam in the darkest moments. The candle passed through a window, the loaf of bread left on a doorstep, the whispered prayer outside a shuttered home. The people of Eyam continued to live with these memories not as burdens, but as reminders of what their village had endured. They carried them gently, the way one might carry a precious stone in the pocket, always close, always known. As the years turned into decades, Eyam stood as a testament to resilience. Travelers came to walk its lanes, to stand before the boundary stones, to visit the graves at Riley and the church where so many prayers had risen. Some said they felt a stillness unlike anywhere else, a peace that could only come from a place that had given so much of itself for others. And when night fell over the village, the hills wrapped Eyam in their familiar silence. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of remembrance, a quiet, sacred space where the courage of ordinary people continued to echo through time. Even now, centuries later, the story of Eyam whispers through its fields and cottages. It reminds all who hear it that love can stand firm where fear might run, that sacrifice can grow where despair once lived, and that the smallest of places can leave the deepest mark on history. Years after the plague had passed and Eyam had returned to a gentler rhythm, the village still felt like a living memorial, quiet, humble, and deeply marked by what it had endured. But the story did not end with survival alone. It continued in the lives of those who remained. in the way they rebuilt their world, in the way memory shaped every step they took. Eyam's strength was not just in what it sacrificed, but in how it chose to live afterward. The survivors often spoke of the moment they realized the village had truly entered a new chapter. It wasn't marked by a ceremony or a proclamation. Instead, it was something simple. A morning when the church bell rang not for a burial, but for a wedding. The sound, which had echoed so often in grief, now carried joy. People paused in their work, listening. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the reminder that life, even after unimaginable sorrow, still found its way forward. As families grew again, new voices filled the lane's children, whose births symbolized renewal. These children grew up hearing stories of the plague year not as tales meant to frighten them, but as lessons of courage and compassion. They learned how their parents and grandparents had stood together when the world outside could not help them. They learned why the boundary stones mattered, why the churchyard was tended so carefully, why names spoken aloud were spoken with reverence. The village, though forever changed, embraced its future. The cottages damaged by neglect were repaired with help from neighbors. Fields were restored line by line, plough by plough. Harvests, once uncertain, began to grow abundant again. Each small step toward normalcy felt like a triumph. Rector Mompesson eventually left Eyam to continue his ministry elsewhere, but his name remained etched in the memory of the village. So did the name of Thomas Stanley, the nonconformist minister who had stood beside him. The people of Eyam remembered them not as leaders who stood above the community, but as men who had walked quietly among them, carrying the same fear, the same grief, the same hope. Visitors continued to arrive in the years that followed, drawn by stories of Eyam's unparalleled sacrifice. Some left letters at the boundary stones, thanking the village for saving their ancestors. Others walked the lane slowly, as if afraid to disturb the spirits of the past. The villagers welcomed them with grace, sharing what they knew, guiding them to the places where history still whispered. Riley Graves became one of the most visited spots. There, among the weathered markers, stood the graves of the Hancock family laid to rest by Elizabeth Hancock herself in an act of love and sorrow that would be remembered for centuries. Standing among these graves, visitors often felt an indescribable stillness, a quiet that seemed to hold every breath, every footstep, every tear shed in the plague year. The story of Emmett Seidel and Roland also became part of Eyam's enduring legacy. Lovers separated by fate, by disease, by duty. People who visited the Delph, where they once stood apart, reported feeling a strange softness in the air, as if the land itself remembered their final parting. Their story became a symbol of love that stayed faithful even when the world fell silent around them. As decades passed, Eyam remained a village of quiet strength. Its lanes never grew loud, its hills never forgot, and its people, generation after generation, passed on the lesson that had defined their ancestors. That true courage is not found in victory or escape, but in the willingness to protect others, even at great personal cost. In the soft hours of evening, when the sky dimmed to shades of amber and violet, villagers often walked to the boundary stones, touching them gently as if greeting old companions. They whispered prayers, not just for their own families, but for all the lives saved long ago by the choice Eyam had made. The stones, warmed by the last light of day, seemed to hum with memory. And when night finally settled over the village, the air grew still, the hills stood watch, and the old cottages glowed softly from within. In that peaceful darkness, Eyam's story lived on, carried in the wind, in the fields, in the hearts of those who knew it. A story of sacrifice, a story of love, a story of a village that stood together when it mattered most. And so, long after the plague, Eyam remained exactly what it had become during that terrible year, a quiet beacon of humanity, glowing in the shadow of history.